Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
Ultimately influence is going to impact results. And so looking at results in the sales process, how we're doing, if we're closing deals, if we're hitting numbers that we're searching for, I think that's probably the easiest way to gauge the level of influence that we have. Now, understanding the elements of what's working and what's not probably takes a little bit more investigation.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe. And with that, let's meet today's guest.
Hi, my name is Ty Bennett. I'm a keynote speaker and the author of 4 books. I'm also the host of the Relevant Leadership Podcast. You can find me at tybennett.com.
On this episode with Ty, we're diving into influence, essentially the principles of influence, how to get it done, what you're doing, which is ruining your chances of having success of influencing anyone, both from in B2B sales, at home, wherever you are, and a whole lot more. So with that, let's jump right into the conversation. How influential we are right now, and how do we know what we're perhaps doing wrong with ourselves and our levels of influence before we get into how to improve it?
Interesting question. I think that, ultimately influence is going to impact results. And so looking at results in the sales process, how we're doing, if we're closing deals, if we're hitting numbers that we're searching for, I think that's probably the easiest way to gauge the level of influence that we have. Now, understanding the elements of what's working and what's not probably takes a little bit more investigation. I'll tell you an interesting experience I had as an early entrepreneur salesperson, 21 years old. I was struggling to get people to buy from me, and I really didn't know why. And I went to a mentor, a friend of mine, and I explained the situation. I said, I'll do anything. What should I do? And he said, I want you to go to the last 5 people who told you no, and I want you to ask them why. And I was like, I'll do anything but that, like anything else, right? But it was such an eye-opening process because I did that. I went back and I asked them, and they shared with me truth of things, blind spots that I didn't realize were there. And so I think sometimes that 360 assessment, whether that's coming from potential clients or it's coming from a manager, a coworker, whoever, sometimes that's an eye-opening process to go through.
And that's interesting, but it's also interesting what you said on the results element of this, because in hindsight, that's obvious. That's obviously the answer to the question. But what I wanted to touch on was when I think about influence, if I think about a stereotypical influential person, it's probably a dude in a smart suit, who has a firm handshake, and, whether you love him or hate him, we won't get into the politics, but a Donald Trump-esque character who's, hard-nosed, and we will get the deal done. And people in B2B sales, some people with that kind of persona and that skill set might do well, but especially the longer term deal cycles, it's people who are perhaps a bit gentler, who can add value, who can consult. Perhaps they're more influential in those scenarios, and there's perhaps multiple ways of getting the same result. So what I wanted to ask you then, Ty, was, is there multiple ways to influence? Is it just the stereotype that I outlined, or can we go about getting the end result in different ways?
I think there's definitely multiple ways, and I think there's a few factors that come into it. One is that for all of us, we have to find our own voice and our own what feels natural and comfortable to us, because one of the things that I think affects our ability to connect with other people, which obviously affects our influence, is being comfortable in our own skin, right? What you described as that powerful, aggressive, kind of stereotypical salesperson is not me. And if I try and be that, then I don't come across the right way to people. I also fundamentally believe that business is long-term and business is about relationships. And so sometimes that person who is more aggressive in your face and who's going to twist arms and close deals, they might have short-term success. But if we think about it long-term, then there's other approaches that may be more appropriate depending on the sales cycle that you're working with.
So let's go the opposite of that stereotype then, because I think we can all understand why that is short term or potentially short term. It depends who you're dealing with. I guess if you're dealing with two Donald Trumps kind of met in the room, they'd probably end up kind of being best friends. So it depends on the person that you're negotiating with, influence with, I'm sure. But if we go for that longer term approach, if we're thinking about relationships first, and perhaps we want to do one deal to get the 7th deal, and that's where the kind of $20 million contract is, what do we need to do up front to set ourselves up for influence success further down the line?
Well, A friend of mine named Bob Berg, he wrote the book The Go Giver. And for anybody who hasn't read that book, I highly recommend it. But the premise of his theory around influence is that influence is about placing other people's interests first. And so if we approach influence from that standpoint in the sales process, I'm looking at it not of, okay, what am I going to get out of it? What's the commission that I'm going to get? How do I close the sale? But how do I help you? How do I add value? How do I find solutions? I like the word that you used a minute ago in terms of a consultant type of role, an advisor, right? How do I become that trusted advisor, which means that I need to have knowledge. I need to bring a skill set to be able to connect and engage. I need to be able to provide solutions, but I also need to come in with your best interest in mind and say, okay, let's get where you want to go. How do we partner in that process?
And is that enough? And what I mean by that is, on paper, that should be enough. I want to meet with someone who's got my business best interests at heart, or my career and also the organization that I'm working for, their best interests. But sometimes I don't want to meet with these people, and it's difficult to put a finger on it. Maybe they caught me the wrong time of day. Maybe the email was just so drab and miserable that I didn't want to reply to it. If would you say that's the core of it? And then perhaps there's other things that kind of turbocharge the influence as well. Is that a potential way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that's the core of it, right? I think that people who come at it from the standpoint of, I want to contribute, I want to add value, I think that is fundamentally the right mindset. But are there other things that factor in? For sure. Are you going to have to be the kind of person who hustles and who is creative to even get the meeting, right? To come at it in different ways, to be persistent in reaching out, sometimes over and over again, to the point that you feel like maybe I'm pushing this too far. Yeah, there's all of those elements. But once you sit down in that meeting and have the opportunity to look at the situation and how can I help you, then I think that mindset is really what comes into play.
Sure. And maybe storytelling comes into this to kind of like lead us on a rabbit hole here. But for the core element of this, how do we demonstrate the fact that we do care about the person, or we potentially we're willing to care about the person if they let us and they let us help them? How do we demonstrate that?
I think there's multiple ways in how you do that. Some of it is just in language choice, and we can talk about storytelling and some of those things. But I think a lot of it also has to do with the approach. I think many salespeople come in, and you can tell right away that they have an agenda and something that they have to get to. I teach people a lot to focus on being interested, not interesting. Right. So instead of how do I come across, how do I position myself, I'm genuinely curious. I want to know what you're dealing with. What are the struggles? What are you seeking for? How can I help you? Uh, and in that approach, if I can be curious from that standpoint, I demonstrate my willingness to jump in and engage with you at a different level than just here's my agenda and here's what I want to pitch you on.
Are there any on that note, Ty? Are there any counterintuitive or unusual questions that we can ask that kind of put across the point that we potentially really care about this individual and their business problems, or how we can help them? Is there any way we can ask a question that isn't kind of what keeps you up at night and all these other sales cliches?
For me, I think right off the bat, not having a scenario in place, right? I don't know that a specific question comes to mind, but as I would train our sales team, we would always have conversations about how it's the question after the question that demonstrates your curiosity, right? It's not necessarily the perfect question, but when you ask a question, they start to open up and you say, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. And you show that genuine curiosity and you dive in a little bit deeper. I think that's where it starts to flush out.
And how does that look in the real world? And I know there's no scenario here, so it's difficult to answer some of these questions with specifics. And we can make up a scenario in a minute if that would make it easier. But how do we know whether, and this is something I struggle with because I will talk to anyone about anything I basically do on the podcast all day, every day. How do we, because an intelligent consultant, to stay on that theme, knows perhaps where the end point is, and we want to lead someone to the end point, or we want to uncover for ourselves if our hypothesis is correct. How do we ask a question after a question, and then probably after a question, and drill down on the important bits? How do we know what's important, and how do we know when we're just chatting for the sake of chatting?
some of that just may be experience. And I know that's kind of an interesting, but because it's just funny as you say that, because as I learned these principles as a young entrepreneur, I remember having sometimes that I went down these rabbit holes and I'm like, this got me nowhere. I just asked a bunch of questions. I was trying to, but yeah, you start to learn how to ask those questions that steer conversation in the way the conversation needs to be led. And then you bring in your expertise and you bring in some ideas of solutions and you bring in your product or your service or whatever it is that you're selling that could be relevant to the conversation. But you uncover that and it's in a very natural way that feels comfortable. Uh, the ability to open someone up and have them share and feel comfortable with you and understand that you're seeking the right solution and that they trust you in that process. I think that's the important piece, is that there's a level of comfort and trust that is started to establish. And there's so many little elements that go into that. And that's where that mindset comes back into play.
So we'll go into comfort and trust in a second. And I know the answer to the last question was essentially experience. And I'm digging here for some silver bullet, for some one-liner that's going to blow people's minds. And I find a lot of the time in these shows, the answer is experience, which is difficult to hear, right?
And here's the thing though, you can speed up experience. You can speed up experience through the amount of effort you put in, right? Some experience is going to come from role playing, from being willing to put in the work, from being willing to get feedback and seek what other people are giving you as feedback. I started to carry this was years ago. I bought this little recorder at Radio Shack and I put it in my pocket and I started to record every presentation, sales conversation that I had and would go back and listen to it. That sped up the learning curve for me so quickly because I was willing to put in the work. So you hear experience and sometimes you're like, well, I don't have experience. What do I do? You can create experience if you're willing to put in the work.
Yeah, because I wanted to stop on this point because I think this is fascinating. And I'm guilty of this myself. I'm always looking for ways to shortcut things. I'm always telling myself that I could be thinking bigger and have bigger aspirations and goals and be putting more hours in or working harder. And as you said, you can learn things faster and you can gain experience perhaps quicker than your competitor if you both start off on the same territory with similar products at the same time. But how much, with regards to being influential within an account or with a group of people and the ability to storytell and all these other things that we know critical with the sales process and having success in business and entrepreneurship and people who marketers listen to the show as well. How critical is just general experience, and is it underrated perhaps?
I think so, but it needs to be the right experience that leads you down the road of developing the right skill set, right? If you are thrust into a situation where you're learning bad sales techniques from somebody and you're maybe not having the right results, then you could go spend 5 years there and it's probably not going to be the kind of experience that puts you in a good place, right? And so the right type of experience, I think it is critical to learn that. And that's why, for me, I love this podcast. Anybody who's watching this or listening to this has a learner's mindset, has a willingness to jump in and learn. Obviously, you're here for a reason. That in and of itself, I think, is what sets apart most people, is that you're willing to put in the time and the effort to perfect a craft, right? Sales is a craft. Being able to communicate and connect with somebody, being able to storytell, all of the skills that go into it, that is a craft that needs to be developed. You're not born with it. And so some people may be a little bit more natural than others, but as you put in the effort to develop the right skill set, you can be extremely effective.
So with that, Ty, so I don't want to lose half the audience here, not just from this show, but for unsubscribing forever. How do we know then whether we are listening to podcasts, we're learning, we're reading books? How do we know when we're doing this and it's accelerating our experience, our knowledge? Especially if I used to be in medical device sales. I wouldn't perhaps read literature that was for surgeons, but I would read all our in-house literature and certain parts of certain procedures with the equipment that I was using. I could physically do on demo units, and I could suture just as well as some of the registrars that I used to train on the laparoscopes and things could as well. It was one thing that, for whatever reason, I've got good spatial awareness and I could do pretty well. So I would go super deep into the knowledge of the niche, the industry, our products as well. But how do we know when we're now just procrastinating versus doing things like role plays and just getting on the damn phone with people?
Well, that's a balance, right? For sure. In sharpening the saw, one of the things I think that's important is that you are constantly learning, but you're also applying, right? It's in the application that those things start to come into play. So let's say you listen to this podcast. At the end of this, what are you going to do with it, right? How are you going to take one of the ideas and go put it in place? So maybe in your next call, you realize that you're going to ask that question, and then you're going to ask that follow-up question and go, that's interesting. Tell me more. Maybe that's your takeaway. I don't know. We're going to talk about more things, so maybe there'll be better takeaways down the line here. But it's in the application. And so I think that's one of those pieces is that learner's mindset. I want to learn that, but I want to go and apply it as quickly as possible and realize that, you're not, I think a lot of times we step back and we go, okay, I've got to be in this perfect scenario to be able to make these calls. And we kind of procrastinate with the excuse that I'm not quite ready. And once I am, then I'm going to go after it. That's just a bunch of garbage because the truth is we're never going to be perfect at it. And so we just have to get to where we feel like we can be confident in approaching it and we're going to learn in the process. And to me, sales is a game. If you treat it like a game that where you're learning and you evaluate and you go, okay, that worked. Okay, I could be better. Let's try it this way. Okay, great. Next time, let's try it this way. Then you're constantly moving forward.
Because it's one of the only roles where there is a finite number that we either win or lose on, right? If you're even in marketing, it's more difficult to measure brand awareness and all these kind of things versus did you close a number of sales today? Is that why perhaps sales is so ripe for kind of gamification?
For sure, I think so. But the other piece of that, to the point you asked, to the question you asked earlier, is if it's a game, you have to be playing to participate, right? It's not a spectator sport. It's not a wow, look at all those people out there selling. You've got to jump in and you've got to talk to people every day, and you start to look at those numbers. And to me, if it's a game, it's a learning process, and every one of those conversations makes you a better person.
For sure. Talking about spectator kind of sports, I don't know how this isn't a TV show. If I have budget and time and energy in the future, it's going to be called Will Sells Everything or Anything. I think it'd be hilarious to watch someone who's perhaps a great salesperson and a terrible salesperson. They make a comedy duo and they go into a BMW dealership and try and sell cars. Then they go and try and sell helicopters. And clearly the helicopters.
I think you're onto something.
That would be an incredible reality TV show.
For sure.
And they go and sell pizza. They go and sell whatever it is. We find some really ridiculous things that, because when you look at it, almost everything that is manufactured, well, pretty much everything that's manufactured is sold at some point, right? Even if it's a tin of baked beans or a tomato sauce, it's sold to the supermarket as opposed to just being lifted off the shelf. So I feel like there's a show there, right?
Yeah, for sure. I was actually reading some research yesterday out of the University of Chicago, Illinois. This researcher looked at like 140 million jobs in the U.S. and across all sorts of people. And her conclusion was that 25% of the national income in the United States is based off of persuasion skills. That's what it comes from. It's based off of selling, in essence, presenting, selling, persuading. And her estimates are that in the next 20 years, 40% of all income will come from those skills. And so this is such an important skill set. Everything, like you said, goes down this road.
Why is this going to go up, Ty? And I'll hesitant guess in that perhaps other roles will become automated, and so it'll just be a bigger chunk. Is that kind of what we're looking at with the data?
For sure, yeah, right. The data shows, if you look at historically, right, the change in terms of what we're doing and what human being jobs are, right, where so many things are being automated and so less and less workforce is being put into manufacturing, development, other things. And so more and more, we're moving more towards the persuasion end of the equation. That's where most people are going to find the ability to make a living. And so, yeah, for sure.
So this goes on multiple levels then. And we kind of touched on the mindset of and the motivations behind influencing someone and having the correct motivation of doing it for perhaps them versus for you. Are there any practical or physical things we should be doing to increase our levels of influence? Because we all know the cliches like mirroring the person that you're sat opposite against. And I don't know whether you agree with this, and there seems to be some data on it, but it seems to be a bit of a weird technique to do as well. If you if you overemphasize it and someone sees you doing it, they're going to be freaked the hell out. What should we be doing practically as we're sat in the room or as we walk into the room to increase our levels of influence? Perhaps we're going into a negotiation or something like that.
Yeah. I'll give you one simple thing that I teach quite a bit to salespeople is a lot of times in conversation. Have you ever had a conversation where somebody seems to one up everything that you say? You know what I'm talking about? Where
I've got
you say
two
something.
friends that I just did it to you there, so I apologize speaking over you. But that was unintentional. But I've got two friends who battle me on everything that I say, and I like to debate things as well. So I can appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I think in a sales role, we've been taught over and over that if you find commonality, that's the best way to make a connection, right? So you walk into somebody's office and you see a picture, a sports team or whatever, and you like that sports team, and you say, "Oh, are you a fan of whatever?" And they say, "Yeah," and say, "Oh, I'm a huge fan too." But what we do in that is we hijack the conversation, we make it about us really quickly. And so I like to teach people what I call the rule of two. And the rule of two is this: whenever somebody says something about themselves, you have to ask at least two questions before you can talk about yourself. So in that same scenario, I would say, "Are you a fan of whatever sports team?" And they say, "Yeah." And say, "Man, did you grow up here? Have you always been a fan?" Right? And there's a natural flow of the conversation where I say at least two because maybe it's two, maybe it's five. But then there's a point where I can come into the conversation. It feels comfortable, but I've made it focused on them, and I haven't just hijacked and said, "Well, let's talk about me now." And that's really how you establish a connection. So that's a very practical thing to start to think about. But I think we all do that in an attempt to find commonality. But the truth is, the best way to make a connection is to make it about them. And if we can do that in effective ways, then we kind of grow in their eyes because of it.
What happens? I never really thought about this before, but if two people listen to this podcast, perhaps there's for some reason a professional buyer is listening, and for some reason, well, not some reason, hopefully it makes sense for a salesperson to listen, and then they start to communicate, and it's potentially a great deal for both sides, so they're both trying to influence each other into just getting a deal done quickly. So what happens then if you're dealing with someone who is also a great influencer like yourself, and you're both trying to push the conversation onto each other? Does that just lead to an interesting conversation, or am I overthinking all
Hopefully.
of this?
No, I think that can happen, right? People, and you can start to see people tend to navigate that direction. I think the foundation of all sales is that we're in the people business. And that's the hard part about sales, is that in the people business, there's not a set protocol of you do A, you do B, you do C, and this
Unfortunately.
happens, right? It'd be great if that were the case.
Yeah.
That's why like set scripts don't really work,
Yeah.
right? Because I can't say the exact same thing to every person and it's going to work out. And so you have to read the situation. I've been in some sales situations where the person said, "Look, I have 5 minutes. Give me your best pitch, and let's see if this is worth spending more time on." It's not an ideal situation, right? I would rather have more time to talk to them, but you adjust to the situation. You go, "Okay, jump in, boom, here's my best sales pitch," and try and create that scenario. So you have to read the situation for what it is and adjust accordingly. And that's the hard part in being in the people business, is that it doesn't always work out the way that you want it to. And you are going to approach it differently with every single person you're in front of.
And this is powerful. Going back to the data we talked about earlier on, from a 20% to 40% percentage of people in essentially the people business, in that if it was step by step, AI would be able to do it for us, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. We'd all lose our jobs anyway. But right now, where we're losing jobs is not in the element of persuasion and human connection. And so developing those skills is what's really going to be relevant in the future.
So, Ty, using kind of this thought process that we've carried on throughout the show, are there any other principles that are somewhat timeless, if not completely timeless, with regards to being able to influence someone? So, one we touched on was putting other people's goals, aspirations before your own as you go into kind of a meeting or conversation. Another one was asking why multiple times rather than throwing the spotlight back on you as soon as you see a commonality. Are there any other principles that are somewhat timeless that we can implement into our sales and just game in general?
For sure. What comes to mind for me is the skill set of storytelling. I think it's one of the most underrated skills in business and in sales. I think people engage with stories. We could go into all the statistics. I wrote a book on storytelling. I'm a big proponent of it. But I'll give you just one idea around storytelling is any story that we tell, especially in business, for it to connect, it needs to follow the pattern of struggle to solution. So the way that it works is you hook people with the struggle, you help them with the solution. Now, this seems logical because when you think about it, any product is there to solve a problem. Any service is there to create a solution, right? We're in business to solve problems. The problem is that for whatever reason, whether it's egocentric or we just want to come from this power position, what we often tell are solution to solution stories. We come in business and we say, you know what, we're great and we've always been great and we'll always be great. And if you work with us, that'd be great. And people are like, see you later. Great. Like it just, there's nothing engaging about it. And so there's a level of vulnerability and authenticity to tell a struggle to solution story, whether that's your own experience or a client success story of where they were and how you helped them, or the development of how this service or product came to be, what this struggle was and how you recognize that and now why it exists. But being able to tell a story extremely well. I mean, the old adage that says whoever tells the best story wins, I think is very true.
How can we implement more stories into our game if clearly experience answers is the solution to this, but if we don't have a ton of experience, perhaps we're somewhat new to selling and we're tuned into the podcast for some tips and advice, and we've seen the word influence, and we've got, right, if we can influence people, we can win new business, but I don't have the stories to kind of leverage the point that you just made there, Ty. What other resources or what other angles can we take to add stories to our game if we've not been selling, like me, medical devices for a decade?
Part of that, I think you can borrow stories for the time being. I think over time, the more personal the stories are, the more powerful they are. But in the beginning, you borrow stories, right? You get a new job as a medical device salesman, and you go in the training, you're going to hear stories from other salespeople that they've used. You're going to ask, hopefully, what stories do you use? What questions do they do work? If you go on a ride along with somebody, you're going to start to look at some of those things. And so you're going to adopt, steal, and borrow some of those stories and start to make them your own so that you can get started in that process. And then over time, you develop more of your own and you start to change those out.
Perfect. That makes total sense. And it's something I'm glad you said that, because we've touched on this on other episodes of the show. And I recommend people just keep some kind of, maybe not physical binder, but perhaps an Evernote, which is software that allows you just put lots of data and notes and can be, it's all searchable, whether you're taking a picture of something or whether you're typing it up. Just have an Evernote of all the stories that your colleagues have given you, and for specific products. Well, this was great in this scenario, it was rubbish in this scenario, and then you can pick and choose them. And obviously you get ingrained into your kind of sales pitch and just everyday chat as you go through. But for a new salesperson, I think that's incredibly useful. Well, with that, Ty, I've got one final question, mate, to ask everyone that comes on the show. And I know you're not kind of a quote unquote sales professional right at this moment, but clearly you're selling, as we all do every single day. So I'll ask you anyway. And the question is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling that has nothing to do with storytelling or, I guess, influence skills?
For me, that piece of advice would be, it took me several years to recognize the value of recording every presentation I was giving and going back and analyzing it and learning from it. If I could have done that years before, I think it would have sped up the learning process for me. So it would be from day one, start to record. Now it's so easy on your iPhone. You just hit the voice memo, like you can record it so simply, but to hear it real time, what you're saying and how you're interacting, is such an eye opener. I would have loved to do that sooner.
For sure. And just to double down on this, there's brands like having the Chorus.ai, Gong.io. These, this is more so, I guess, for the sales leaders who are listening, but they will record sales calls. They will use AI or machine learning, really. It's not really AI, to say, well, you talked too much. You brought up price here when best people or the better sellers bring it up earlier in the conversation. You used negative language rather than positive language. All these kind of things, which is more for B2B sales calls and cold calls as opposed to sales presentations, which are more, I guess, complex or bespoke. But there's definitely kind of data and algorithms which can come along and help with some of this moving forward. So I'll plug those two shows, those two brands, even though they don't sponsor the show, and they definitely should do, because it's the future. And with that, Ty, tell us a little bit more where we can find out, because we've touched on a couple of books. Tell us about the books and where we can find out more about you as well, sir.
So, two books that I've written that really pertain to this conversation: The Power of Influence and The Power of Storytelling. You can find those on Amazon. You can find them on my site, tybennett.com, just my name. And I host the Relevant Leadership Podcast. You can find that on my site or at anywhere you find your podcasts. And we dive into sales leadership. I interview great people. It's a fun process. So, yeah, look forward to connecting with everyone.
Perfect. Well, anyone who's joined this conversation, very quickly, if you're on your phone, just go from your app, straight search into that and download and subscribe to Ty's as well. I'll link to everything that we talked about. For anyone who's running on a treadmill right now and doesn't want to get kind of mowed down by themselves as they try and subscribe to your podcast, Ty, I'll link to everything in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.org. And with that, Ty, I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.